Good afternoon, webinar world. I can't hear you guys. Good afternoon, webinar world. A little bit more enthusiasm. Come on, I can't hear you still. Good afternoon. I'm just kidding. I can't hear you guys because you're all on mute. Feel free to multitask, have a snack, have a beverage, and welcome to the Lunch and Learn with the Florida Healthcare Law Firm. I am your host today, your favorite attorney, Michael Silverman. I joined the Florida Healthcare Law Firm a few months back after previously serving as general counsel to a nationally licensed mail order durable medical equipment and pharmacy provider. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, jumping into the pharmacy business. I must, of course, give you the typical legal disclaimer. This webinar is not intended to be or construed as my providing you with legal advice. We're going to be discussing matters very generally. Everyone's situation is very unique and fact specific. So before taking any actions, please do your due diligence. That is actually going to be a theme throughout my presentation this afternoon. Do your due diligence, extreme vetting. All that said, sit back, relax, eat some lunch, and let's hopefully learn a thing or two. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be discussing the different ways to get involved with the practice of pharmacy as an owner, and general ongoing business and compliance matters and considerations. Let me give you a high-level overview of what we'll be talking about. This presentation is essentially going to be broken into 4 parts. The first part is the pharmacy practice generally. What's required to get started? What does everyone need as far as licenses and registrations? The second part of the presentation, we're going to be talking about starting a practice from scratch, building essentially from the ground up, not acquiring something, but creating something. The third part, instead of building from the ground up, we're going to be talking about purchasing something that's existing. We'll go into some detail on the pros and cons of starting from scratch versus acquiring something that already exists. And then the last part of today's presentation, we're going to be discussing some just general and ongoing considerations, operational and compliance-wise, with respect to how to best situate yourself. So you're interested in becoming an owner of a pharmacy? If that's the case, let's dig in and really test you and let's find out. So what types of pharmacies exactly are out there? What are your options? What am I even talking about? Well, Florida, where I'm situated, it recognizes the 5 following types of pharmacies. You have your community pharmacy, which is your typical retail pharmacy that's open to the public, dispenses medications on an outpatient basis. You have institutional pharmacies, think hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, and other healthcare institutions where drugs are internally stored, dispensed, and sold. You have a nuclear pharmacy where radioactive drugs and chemicals are compounded, dispensed, stored, or sold. The 4th version that Florida recognizes is the specialty pharmacy, which is by definition in the Florida statute a catch-all for pharmacies that are not otherwise defined. Essentially those that aren't full service, think that they specialize in certain medications, HIV, immunodisease treatments, things to that nature. And the last pharmacy type that is recognized by the state of Florida is the internet pharmacy, which is defined as those that use the internet to communicate with or to obtain information from consumers, and that use that communication to fill or refill prescriptions. Today, we are largely going to be discussing the requirements of the most typical pharmacy classification type, the one that I typically deal with the most and that my clients come to own or acquire, which is the community or retail pharmacy. So now that we've discussed what types of pharmacy practices are out there, what are the necessary licenses and registrations of a facility, of a pharmacist and technicians? Let's dig right in. Facility, it needs a pharmacy license. It's got to be licensed as one of the types that are recognized by your state, one of the types that we just went through. The pharmacy is also going to need an NPI number, which stands for National Provider Identification Number. And that's a 10-digit identification number issued to United States healthcare providers by CMS. It's largely now used for billing purposes. You're also going to need, the facility is going to need an NCPDP number. That's the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, and that's a 7-digit unique identifier for pharmacies. Had previously been used in some billings, but now it's largely used for identification and contracting purposes. And pharmacies also need to fill out an online profile of their pharmacy, update their licenses, provider type, ownership information, required to be maintained and updated timely. And the last type of registration or license that's applicable to a facility is a DEA registration, required for the dispensing of any controlled substances. Even if you have no intention on dispensing controlled substances, usually required to have it for certain purposes that we will be getting into later. So what other types of licenses, registrations? Your pharmacist, of course. You need to have a pharmacist. You can have more than one pharmacist, but you need to have a single PIC, or pharmacist in charge. That takes ultimate responsibility. Now, the pharmacist in charge, the PIC, usually has to be dedicated as a PIC to only one pharmacy unless an exemption applies. Staying here within the state of Florida, you can only be the registered PIC of a single pharmacy location. If a pharmacy is looking to expand its operations into other states as a non-resident pharmacy, where it's, it resides in Florida but may wish to dispense drugs through mail into other states, about a dozen plus other states require that the pharmacy not only be licensed in that state, but they also require the PIC to be licensed in that state. They have to take an exam, and they need to either physically present to that state to sit for the exam, and or possibly present to the Board of Pharmacy for final approval. Now, the last license type generally applicable to pharmacies and the practice of pharmacy is technicians. Those that assist the pharmacist. You can be a certified or registered technician here in the state of Florida. And as I stated, the technicians assist the pharmacist with drug preparation, dispensing, billing, etc. But they must be properly supervised at all times. And speaking of proper supervision, you can only have so many technicians that are permitted to be engaged in pharmacy practice per each pharmacist that's present at the pharmacy. Each state board of pharmacy will have their own ratios. In Florida, it's typically a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio, where you can have one pharmacist to 3 techs or one pharmacist to 4 techs. It really just depends on the jurisdiction and exceptions that may apply. Now, last thing we're going to talk about generally about the pharmacy practice is ownership requirements. Now, in Florida, non-practitioners, laypersons such as myself and many of you out there, we're permitted to be owners of a pharmacy without having to be a practitioner, or without having to have a practitioner involved in the ownership, or without the need to have an additional license. Like in Florida, typically if there are laypersons involved in an ownership of a clinic, you need to have a healthcare clinic license, but not required in Florida for pharmacy ownership, and as far as I understand, it's not required largely throughout the country. So you can be a typical businessman and get involved in the ownership of a pharmacy. However, there are understandably some ownership restrictions in place. We're not talking about selling widgets. We are talking about dispensing drugs to be consumed by humans, and you need to have certain restrictions in place for that, of course. Now, the Florida statutes, like I said, many persons generally are able to have ownership interest in the pharmacy. They just exclude certain individuals with certain felony criminal convictions, such as social or economic frauds, if they've had any controlled substance violations, and typically only those that have had issues in the healthcare industry are prevented from owning a pharmacy in the state of Florida. If they've been terminated by a state Medicaid program, if they have any convictions of crimes pertaining to the practice of pharmacy, anyone listed on the OIG exclusion list, obviously, and just any general healthcare fraud convictions will prohibit you in the state of Florida from being an owner of a pharmacy. But like I said, otherwise, they're generally wide open, and any business man or woman can be a pharmacy owner. Now, owners are required to submit fingerprints to the Florida Department for FBI background clearance. And you're also required to make disclosures, whether you've had any ownership interest in any pharmacy permits that have had disciplinary actions in the past 5 years, or whether you've relinquished any licenses. But that said, again, there's not any major prohibitions. So we've discussed the different types of pharmacies out there, the general different licenses and registrations for facility, pharmacists, and technicians, and the ownership requirements. Now let's talk about starting a pharmacy practice from scratch. Here's a little overview. We're going to talk about the facility. We know it has to be licensed, but what does it need to do to get one? We're going to talk about the Board of Pharmacy licensure process. What do you have to do to become actually licensed? And DEA registration. How does a pharmacy obtain one, and why is it important? And of course, later on in the presentation, we're going to be analyzing the starting from scratch that we're talking about here versus acquiring an existing pharmacy. Pros and cons of each. What's better? So let's dig into starting from scratch, your facility requirements. So what's necessary to get the pharmacy in shape to apply for it and successfully obtain its pharmacy permit from the Board of Pharmacy? Well, let's start with location. Location, location, location. Where's the best place to be situated? Is it a busy strip mall? Is it a standalone facility, a shopping center, part of a supermarket, an industrial center? Well, the answer in part depends on what the pharmacy's classification is, retail, institutional, internet, etc., and the customers that it's looking to attract. Now, equipment. What's necessary in order to get the pharmacy, the facility, in shape for the actual inspection? Well, you typically need a hot and cold industrial sink that is easily accessible from the prescription counter, a refrigerator that is properly monitored with respect to temperature. You need a secured drug department. Whether it needs to be properly locked and physically barriered from entry will depend on the state and a lot of other different aspects. Typically need an alarmed facility. You may need a safe depending on if you're going to be dispensing controlled substances. You got to be properly zoned, of course. And you need to have your proper property and casualty insurance, and you're going to need posted hours of operation. So there's really, there's not that much that's required to get your facility in shape. It's more about finding the proper location and building it out accordingly. So your application in getting your initial license from scratch. Essentially, in the state of Florida, you can fill it out online or you mail in a physical application answering all questions about the business and its owners. We discussed some of those disclosures on the previous slide. And the fee in the state of Florida is $255 for a community retail license. Now, preparation, major key component to actually getting your license. Now, after submitting your application to the Board of Pharmacy in Florida, they'll begin processing it. And once the application is deemed full and complete, inspectors will conduct an on-site inspection to confirm compliance with its regulations. And thorough preparation for the on-site inspection is absolutely paramount to obtaining the pharmacy permit. So we're going to talk about the on-site inspection, what you can expect in the inspection, and how to succeed. Now, in addition to confirming that the facility meets the equipment requirements that we discussed on the previous slide, such as a hot and cold sink, they're going to judge, the Board of Pharmacy inspector is going to judge compliance with the rules and regulations. Now, a lot of this stuff seems extremely simple and straightforward, and a lot of it is, but you guys would be extremely surprised about the small slip-ups that folks encounter, pharmacy owners, that cause major issues with either their initial license inspection, the routine inspection that's typically unannounced every few years, and there's also inspections required for certain changes. Now, what do you need to do? What kind of checklist does the Board of Pharmacy inspector have? Again, a lot of these are very simple, but if you slip up on even a single one of them, it can either prevent you from getting your initial license, or it can cause your existing license to be jeopardized if it's just a routine every few year inspection, which they do every couple of years. So you need proper signage. You need your hours of operation posted. You have to meet the minimum required. Some states let the owner decide how many hours a week, how many days a week that they're going to be open. Others require a minimum of, let's call it 20 or 30 hours. Florida does have a minimum hourly operation that if you want to go below, you have to get permission to do so. You need your business certifications displayed. The inspector is going to look for that stuff. You need the pharmacist and the technician licenses displayed. And very importantly, something that many people slip up on is that you need proper identification badges worn at all times by your pharmacist and technician. I can't tell you how many clients have been dinged either for the initial on-site or the routine inspection. You need reference materials. You have to have the ability to readily access that state's pharmacy laws and rules. Typically can have a hard copy or just show the inspector that you have the ability to electronically access it. You need evidence of verbal and printed offers to consult. You need to show that you can properly label medications on the initial on-site inspection, and for the routine ones that you'll actually have labels in place. You need policies and procedures. The inspector is going to want to know that you have CQI programs in place, continuous quality improvement programs. Also, that if you intend to do any controlled substances, that you have proper dispensing records and inventory records in place, and that you're properly set up for that. Also, need to comply with the prescription drug monitoring program. And finally, the inspector may ask some information pertaining to the wholesalers, the vendors, manufacturers that you anticipate using. Now, if the inspection went satisfactory and everything's all good, then you expect after the inspection for your permit number to be issued within 30 days. Very exciting stuff. And once you get your pharmacy permit and you're starting from scratch, you should be very proud, because it takes a lot of work to do so. Now, what's this DEA registration about? Let's talk about that. Unlike your Board of Pharmacy application, the DEA application is very, very short and easy. It's essentially just a page long. However, you cannot even apply for your DEA registration until you have your Board of Pharmacy license, which we discussed the process of obtaining. And you also need your NPI and NCPDP numbers, which are very easy to obtain and can be done online fairly quickly. So the major impediment to the DEA registration is your Board of Pharmacy license. Now, your application fee is $731. Again, I stated that's a very short and easy application. Ask a handful of questions, really just check mark boxes pertaining to the practice of pharmacy, whether you've had any disciplinary actions pertaining to controlled substance violations, and they essentially just ask you to indicate the schedules of controlled substances that the pharmacy is desiring to register for. Now, the preparation, here's where the DEA application process becomes much more in-depth. They typically, the DEA agent assigned with inspecting and reviewing your facility will send out a questionnaire prior to coming out after receiving your application. And this is much more in-depth than the application. After submitting it, you'll receive this questionnaire, and they'll ask all types of information. They want to know information about the structure the pharmacy is located in, what type of building materials. They want to ensure that it's a sound facility. They want a detailed description of the proposed operation. They want to know your expected customer base. What types of controlled substances do you expect to be handling? What's the percentage of controlled substances that you anticipate dispensing in comparison with your overall dispensing practices? They want to know information about the company and its owners. You'll have to submit incorporation documents, copies of all your permits and licenses, Board of Pharmacy, show that zoning is appropriate. And they're going to ask detailed questions about the owners and their interests, their ownership interest, their percentage of ownership interest. So they dig in deep. They want to know everything. They want to know if any of the owners also have any related businesses. They'll want to know information about all the pharmacy's employees, specifically your pick and technician. They want to know if there's any experience. This is a big one, with the handling of controlled substances from the past. Do the owners have experience? Does the pharmacist in charge have any experience? They want to know information about what vendors you anticipate using. And most importantly, they want to know about compliance and responsibility. This is where many people slip up. Who's going to be ordering the controlled substances? What are the policies and procedures that are in place for ordering and receiving them? Who has access to the controlled substances? What are the security features? Do you have an alarm? Who's monitoring it? What's the extent of the monitoring? Is it just your front and back door entryways? Is the controlled substance storage area alarmed? Are there any panic alarms? Now, unfortunately, there is no single answer as to what the DEA is expecting and looking for. It really depends on the area that the pharmacy is located in. What are the crime rates? What are the expected operations of the pharmacy? What types and amounts of controlled substances are expected to be on hand? It could be just a prescription drug, have again, it just depends on the operations. Now, again, who's responsible for the day-to-day operations and who's responsible for overall operations? These can be tricky questions. It is not enough for owners to just point the finger at the pharmacist in charge and state that, hey, that person's responsible. The owners have to be required to be able to recognize when the pharmacist in charge is not doing their job. I've heard many stories of folks, owners slipping up in this regard when the DEA comes to do their on-site inspection in advance of the registration. An owner will just point the finger at the pharmacist, and that's the easiest way to have your inspection end very quickly and unfavorably. Again, it's not enough to just point the finger at the PIC and say, hey, they're responsible with knowing the laws and complying with controlled substance regulations. The owners are required to recognize when the PIC is not doing their job, so they need to be familiar with the regulations. Now, the on-site inspection, the DEA will contact the owner and or the pharmacist in charge to schedule the on-site inspection in advance. So there should not be any surprise to anyone, and there's no reason not to be well prepared. You should be prepared from the moment you submit the application. During the on-site inspection, the DEA agent is going to confirm accuracy with respect to everything that was submitted in the questionnaire response, and to confirm that proper security features are in place. You need to be prepared for this on-site inspection. It's typically one bite at the apple, unfortunately. Again, can't just point the finger at the PIC. And I've heard of situations where, again, the inspection ends very quickly and unfavorably because the owners are not prepared to answer such questions. And inadequate answers will result in a request to withdraw the application if the pharmacy is lucky, and will likely just result in a flat-out denial of the application. So why is any of this necessary? Why do you need to apply to the DEA for a controlled substance registration if you're not even intending on dispensing any controlled substances? Why is it necessary to go through the time, the hassle, the expense of receiving this registration? Well, unfortunately, it largely boils down to insurance company and payer contracting requirements. They'll typically require that a retail pharmacy that desires to be in its network is full service, and they will not admit a pharmacy into its network unless it meets those requirements. So even if you're not intending on dispensing any controlled substances, it's likely best for you to obtain, for the pharmacy to obtain that registration anyways. And it can have the registration and not do any dispensing, and that's of course fine. After the on-site inspection, DEA agent will submit their report to their supervisor for final review and approval. So purchasing an existing pharmacy as compared to starting one from scratch. Maybe you're not interested in going through the time and expense of finding a location to lease or to purchase, doing any necessary build out, applying to the Board of Pharmacy, preparing for the inspection, receiving your pharmacy license, applying to the DEA, preparing for that inspection, receiving your controlled substance registration, and then going through applying to payers so that the pharmacy actually has the ability to bill patients. These steps and processes can very easily take 6 months or more, and they sound exhausting. So, is there any way to bypass these steps and to just immediately become a pharmacy owner? Well, the answer is yes. And how can you do that? Well, depending on the state that you're in, the process can be expedited through an acquisition. It depends on how that acquisition is structured and, again, the jurisdiction the pharmacy is located in. So we're going to talk about purchasing an existing pharmacy now and compare that to the whole process of starting from scratch. What type of acquisition should it be? What are the pros and cons of each? So we're going to talk about asset versus stock acquisition of an existing pharmacy, and as far as becoming an owner quicker than the scratch process. So what's the difference? Generally, in an asset deal, a purchaser typically picks which parts of a business that it likes and which it doesn't, and it purchases what it likes and puts those new assets into a new entity. In the pharmacy industry, maybe a prospective purchaser is interested in acquiring a pharmacy's assets that include its patient base and potentially certain contracts, such as lease or billing hardware and software agreements. They'll take what they find valuable and leave behind what they do not, such as liabilities. Now, stock acquisitions, the purchaser is buying the entire organization, the good and the bad. You can contract away the bad through indemnification provisions, also by paying the purchase price over time. That would allow for the new owner to withhold any payments should unanticipated liabilities present themselves. Now, how does a stock or an asset acquisition help us with respect to becoming an owner quicker than starting from scratch? Well, in the state of Florida, a change of identity requires an entirely new application to be submitted and essentially restarts the new registration process. Pharmacy permits are not transferable in the state of Florida. Well, however, the Board of Pharmacy does not consider a stock acquisition to be a quote unquote change of identity, so long as the tax ID, the FEIN number, remains the same after the sale. So this is great news. As such, if a pharmacy is bought pursuant to a legitimate stock acquisition, as opposed to an asset acquisition, and the pharmacy's operations remain the same policies and procedures, same location, etc., the new owners essentially just need to notify the board within 15 days of closing and submit for fingerprinting. So in the state of Florida, again, you can do a stock acquisition and bypass this entire process. An asset acquisition will not do it, only a stock one. In many states, such as Florida, the only way to jump straight into the pharmacy business without going through the months-long licensure process can only be done through this type of stock acquisition. However, a big however, certain states, regardless of a stock or an asset purchase, will require advance notification of the acquisition and may even require an entirely new application. Take the following example. A pharmacy that you're looking to acquire located in Florida. It holds a resident pharmacy permit in the state of Florida where it does its dispensing out of, but it holds non-resident pharmacy permits in states that it mails drugs that it dispenses from the Florida facility to other states. Now, the owner, in doing their the prospective buyer, in doing their due diligence of the pharmacy, will need to ensure prior to the acquisition that they're aware of the notification requirements of all states that the pharmacy holds a permit in, to prevent the unintended loss or the lapse of a state pharmacy permit. In our example, where you're purchasing a Florida pharmacy in a stock acquisition, while that's permissible in the state of Florida to just jump right in and just notify them, let's assume that the Florida pharmacy holds non-resident permits in states like North Carolina and California. Now, those states require at least, North Carolina requires at least 6 weeks advance notification, even if it's a stock acquisition. And I believe California requires even longer, and there's other states that require advance notification prior to the closing. So do your due diligence, do your vetting, know what is going on. So those are the pros and cons of an asset versus stock purchase. Essentially, the only way to jump right into the pharmacy business is a stock purchase. You can, of course, do an asset acquisition and help speed along the process of becoming operational, but it's not going to help you out with your licensure process. So as Florida allows a person or an entity to purchase a stock of a pharmacy without having to go through the application process, why in the world doesn't everybody do it? Well, this is when we talk about due diligence and extreme vetting. When you do a stock acquisition, as I discussed, you are acquiring all known and unknown liabilities. They stay with the corporation that is being acquired. Again, you can, of course, contract out known and unknown liabilities, by writing them into the contract that you have with the previous owner, where the previous owner will indemnify the new owner against known and unknown liabilities, or better yet, for the new owner to pay the purchase price over time in anticipation of unknown liabilities, which would then be offset. However, such provisions are only as good as the person who signed them. And you don't want to have to chase anyone down after the fact. You want to know what you're getting into. You want to do extreme vetting if you are buying the stock of a pharmacy. And we'll talk about why. A typical review of business records is just the beginning. Again, we are not selling widgets. Pharmacy dispenses drugs. It needs to be safe. And you need to do a deep dive. Your typical business records, financial statements, business contracts, that's just not going to do it. Of course, you want to know what you're getting into, what you're requiring, how long the lease is, how long your equipment rentals, software, and hardware are. But most importantly, with respect to the viability of a business, you need to know what type of issues they may have had with regulators concerning the pharmacy industry, various boards of pharmacy, and the payers that are involved. You absolutely need to conduct a deep dive with an experienced analyst. Here at the Florida Healthcare Law Firm, we work with several different consultants who will dive right in there on behalf of the prospective purchaser and do their due diligence. And they'll do it on behalf of a prospective seller as well, because they want to know what type of issues that they may have to confront in the sales process. Now, what type of deep dives are we talking about beyond business records? Well, first, you're going to want to do a licensure analysis. You're going to want to review any and all applications to any boards of pharmacies to ensure that they are truthful. You're going to want to ensure that the pharmacy is properly licensed in all the states that it has ever dispensed into. And you're also going to want to do a thorough review of any disciplinary actions that existing pharmacy may have had in any jurisdiction that it's licensed in. And not only that, you need to make sure that any disciplinary actions were properly reported. It sounds rather asinine, but failure to report a disciplinary action that you had in one state not only will cause disciplinary actions in other states, but typically if you're fined in one state and then go report it to another state that you're licensed in, they'll give you another fine just because of being fined in the first state. But if you don't report it, then you are subject to a loss of licensure, and the entire structure that you built could collapse. So you want to ensure that the business that you're looking to acquire has properly reported such things. Don't want it to come back and bite you, the new owner. Also going to want to do the same thing with the DEA. You're going to want to review the application and the records, make sure that they never did any controlled substance dispensing without a DEA registration. So we're going to continue our due diligence requirements if you're looking to do a stock acquisition. In addition to looking at licenses, the Board of Pharmacy licenses and DEA registration, you're going to want to do a thorough review of payer contracts. You want to review the applications. You want to review any audits. You want to review any disciplinary actions that a payer, a PBM, has levied upon the pharmacy you're looking to acquire. And of course, you're going to want to know if they've been terminated by any insurance payers. You're going to want to do a dispensing analysis, review the past several years of records of dispensing records from the pharmacy that you're looking to acquire. You're doing an internal audit. Do the audit results conform with the above standards? Have they ever dispensed into states they weren't licensed? Have they dispensed controls without registration with the DEA? Have they complied with payer dispensing requirements as far as quantity dispensed, as far as shipping? You don't want to acquire something that months later or even a year or two later, because of the previous pharmacy's owner, is going to result in the business being shut down. So you got to do your due diligence. And you want to ensure you do, I can't speak about this enough, a regulatory compliance analysis. How is the previous pharmacy owner doing its marketing? Were they complying with the HIPAA, the PHI safeguarding regulations, the anti-kickback statute, Stark regulations? Was there any relationships with physicians? One of my taglines I like with respect to buying an existing pharmacy is that you need to know what you're biting into before you chow down. Chow, of course, stands for a change of ownership. So before you do a stock acquisition and become the new owner, you got to know what you're biting into before you chow. Any issues, again, that the pharmacy being acquired has had in the past or may have in the future because of past behavior stays with the entity that's being acquired with a chow. Typically, there's a 2-year audit look back that payers such as PBMs have. And if a pharmacy that you're buying today engaged in operations last year or the year before that could jeopardize contracts or licenses going forward, then you could have purchased something that could very soon be worthless. Again, you want to do extreme vetting, know what you're getting into. So let's assume that you found that golden gem, that existing pharmacy that passes our extreme vetting process. Now, what needs to be done for a smooth transition of the pharmacy that you just acquired? Well, you want to ensure a proper transition, and that all starts with the Board of Pharmacy change of ownership processes. Again, as I alluded to earlier, all states are different. Florida allows an immediate takeover of a pharmacy through a stock acquisition. Others do not. It all depends on the jurisdiction that you're in. Some may require advanced notification. Again, California and North Carolina require advanced notifications, among other states, if there is a change of ownership, even with a stock acquisition. The DEA, we don't want that registration to expire because that could negatively affect some of the contracts that you acquired with the pharmacy. So you're going to want to, in advance, notify the DEA, or you may have a lapse in registration. And payer contracts. The pharmacy that you're buying has payer contracts, either directly straight with a PBM or indirect through a Pharmacy Services Administration Organization, a PSAO. Typically, the larger PBMs require direct contracting, and the little guys come with a PSAO. But you're going to want to ensure proper and timely notifications to all those payers, all those contracts, to prevent any lapses. Any accreditation entities, maybe the pharmacy has a VIPS or direct mail order pharmacy accreditation. Maybe it has other accreditations, but you're going to want to ensure, if that's part of what you're buying, that it sticks with the entity and that you follow any notification processes. And then, of course, you're going to have your typical business notifications and permissions that you're going to need to have. You're going to make sure that the lease is transferable to a new owner for the facility, or that the hardware, software, things to that nature. So so far we've spoken about the general process of what types of licenses are needed for the facility, for the technician, the pharmacist to pick. We discussed starting a pharmacy from scratch, the process that you need to do in order to become licensed from the very beginning with the Board of Pharmacy and the DEA. And we also discussed a stock acquisition of pharmacies and how that can help bypass the time and expense during a lot of the build-out processes. So what's better? Building from scratch, starting from the ground up, or an acquisition? Let's talk about the pros and cons. Time, money, and liabilities. Time, likely only able to save time through a stock acquisition as it concerns your licensure. Again, Florida, you can hop right in there through a stock acquisition. Again, need to analyze other states. Money's a trick one. It costs money to do the build out, of course, and it costs money to carry the lease and your employees while you're waiting to get licensed. So that costs money starting from scratch. It also costs a lot of money to buy something that exists that's worth buying. So you're really going to need to weigh those out. And liabilities, of course, if you're doing a stock acquisition, you need to heavily investigate any potential liabilities, both monetary and regulatory. Any previous issues with boards of pharmacies, insurance companies, payers, regulatory disciplinary history, all that stuff you're going to need to know, and you're going to need to weigh very, very heavily. My friends, it all boils down to what the marketplace has to offer, and getting comfortable with potential risks of an acquisition. If time is your friend, it may be best to build from the ground up. You know exactly what you are getting into and what you are acquiring. So we've covered a lot so far. We've covered many, many things: getting licensed, acquiring a pharmacy. Now let's talk about some general considerations. Be it starting from scratch or acquiring something that's existing, there are certain things that you're going to need, just regardless, to be up and running. You need proper funding, licenses, build out, and acquisition costs. That takes a lot of money. You're going to need software and hardware, billing and patient management programs also, which can get very expensive. You need policies and procedures in place. You need to comply with HIPAA. You need to have inventory and storage, CQI policies, drug sourcing, logbooks. You need to ensure that you are properly licensed and registered in all the states that you're required to be so. State boards of pharmacy and pharmacists as necessary. If you're in multiple states, some states just require that the facility register, fill out a non-resident pharmacy application, and others require that the pharmacist actually be licensed in that state, that the PIC holds a license. Again, there's about a dozen plus ones of those, so you're going to want to stay very on top of that and always make sure that both the facility and the PIC's licenses are timely and properly renewed so that they do not lapse. You're going to need your NCPDP and NPI numbers, your DEA registration. Payer contracting. Regardless of whether you start from scratch or acquire one, you need to make sure you have your payer contracts in place. Again, you can use a PSAO, a Pharmacy Service Administration Organization, to get all of the small payer contracts, but the larger players, especially Express Scripts, typically Optum Rx, CVS Caremark, etc., the big boys, they require the pharmacy contract directly with it typically. You need a wholesaler. Some of the big guys, Cardinal, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, those are some of the bigger players in the industry regarding drug sourcing. And PBMs, the payers that you're submitting your claims to as a pharmacy, they will, I can promise it, they will audit who your payer sources are. They typically require that you receive product through the primary distributor, which is the person who gets it from the manufacturer, or the manufacturer themselves. And they will actually withhold monies. I've seen several $100,000 withheld from pharmacies over allegations that the drugs were improperly sourced. And on top of many payers requiring either the primary distributor or the manufacturer to be sourcing it to the pharmacy, Optum Rx over the past 2 years has essentially required that all of its pharmacies in the network receive drugs from a VAUD accredited wholesaler. What in the world is VAUD? VAUD stands for Verified Accredited Wholesale Distributors, and that accreditation is issued by the NABP, which is the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. There's been a lot of pushback with this against Optum, especially because NABP, who issues the VAUD accreditation, they have been extremely behind due to the flood of applications to get VAUD accredited that Optum Rx's requirements have caused. So those are the general getting started considerations. How about ongoing considerations? Now that you're up and running, what do you need to do to excel? Well, let me give you some general ongoing operational and compliance considerations. Patient generation, marketing. How are you getting patients? It's great to have a business with contracts and licenses, but unless you have any patients, you're not going to be in business very long. So let's talk about some marketing. You have grassroots marketing. You get involved in local trade shows and fairs and community outreach. Maybe you can get involved in some specialized services for community needs. Maybe there is a large diabetic population in your area. Maybe there's a large epidemic of obesity in your area. I know it's kind of largely throughout the country. Maybe you can offer dietary supplements or specialized foods for obese or diabetic folks. Think about what's in your community and what type of services are needed. Social media and Google AdWords, all great ways to generate a buzz about your business and to generate additional patients. And the last one I want to talk about is lead generation. Now, this will likely lend itself to an entirely an entire another webinar, as there's a lot of pitfalls in this area. You have to be very, very wary and aware of the rules and regulations concerning both telemarketing and telemedicine. You want to make sure that nothing that you're doing implicates the anti-kickback statute, the patient beneficiary inducement statute, and things to that nature. You should not be ever paying for prescriptions or patients on a per patient basis. You need to make sure that you comply with the rules and regs. There's a lot of nefarious activity that I've seen splattered all throughout the internet with both telemarketing call centers and telehealth physicians. So there's a lot of illicit behavior out there that you want to be aware of. You need to comply with all the dispensing policies and procedures. And again, the federal and state anti-kickback statutes and START regulations, HIPAA, drug sourcing, DQSA and DSCSA, federal drug sourcing requirements, in general, other business matters such as false and deceptive trade practices regarding marketing. You need to follow those. You need to make sure you properly renew pharmacy and pharmacist licenses, which are renewed every couple of years depending on the state and jurisdiction. Don't want those to lapse. And you need to make sure you respond to and alleviate any disciplinary actions, and that you properly report them to other boards of pharmacy as may be applicable to your operations. Additional revenue sources, let's talk about that. Ways to generate additional business for your pharmacy is just by having over-the-counter and general retail products that you're selling to your walk-in patients. Something I see a lot of pharmacies interested in or even dabbling in already is selling CBD, a derivative from the hemp plant. I have not done enough due diligence and research on that myself in order to properly advise clients or vet it. But it gives me kind of the heebie-jeebies a little bit because pharmacies are regulated at the federal level by the DEA. Obviously, if you have that registration, and at the federal level, last time I checked, CBD was still a Schedule I controlled substance. So if you have CBD on the shelf, I personally would be concerned if the DEA walked in. I know there's some regulations that are changing in that regard. Another additional revenue source is DME POS. For the pharmacy to become a durable medical equipment supplier enrolled with Medicare. Pharmacies, you guys have a leg up on traditional DME suppliers. While some products don't require any state-issued licenses for DME, such as over-the-counter, off-the-shelf orthotics in Florida, many DME supplies require, such as for respiratory equipment and supplies. In Florida, again, pharmacies have a leg up. Entities that hold a pharmacy permit under Florida Chapter Statutes 465 is exempted from the need to obtain an HME license from the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration. So got a tremendous leg up on the ability to jump into the DME industry as a pharmacy, something you should certainly explore. Now, guys, there is no way to sugarcoat it. The cards are stacked against independent pharmacies. The time seems to have come and gone when an independent pharmacy could survive solely based on walk-in business. Pharmacies got to deal with a lot of regulatory hurdles, audits, the threat of monetary clawbacks, and the constant threat of being terminated from insurance networks. Oftentimes, the insurance networks or the PBMs that you're dealing with are not neutral in this industry, but they have skin in the game insofar as they both manage benefits and have competing mail-order pharmacies. I'm calling you out, PBMs, at least some of you. The less independent pharmacies in their network, the more patients that they have access to provide and dispense to through their own pharmacies. But fret not, my friends. So long as you comply with the appropriate rules, regulations, and licensure requirements specific to your operations, becoming a pharmacy owner can be a highly rewarding and lucrative endeavor. By ensuring your organization is surrounded by the best internal and outside support staff possible throughout this entire process, both becoming licensed and ongoing operations, that's the key to success. I thank everyone for taking the time to join me today. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Please stay tuned for my next webinar presentation in the next couple months, and the constant articles and blogs that the great attorneys at the Florida Healthcare Law Firm put out, always packed full of the latest and greatest information. I thank you again, you all, for joining me, and I hope you all take care until next time.